we have a line that has stuck here at 3rd Wave, and it's now sort of on much of our marketing material, that 3rd Wave is freaking control for control freaks, right? Because we all know that trade compliance people are control freaks, and so they have to be.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hello, folks. We're back for a Simply Trade podcast, and we are in for another good edition. And this is going to be a good discussion today, but I will say that I am not donning my cowboy hat today. It's like I've already been out to the pool and jumped in there and swam this morning, which was really nice, believe it or not. So anyway, I came back in, took a quick shower, jumped up in here. So here I am. Lalo, we're recording this. This is now late spring, and the weather's finally warming up enough. So it's like it's been good. But I will say you and I have had some travels. We've done 3 conferences in 30 days. We've had Simply Trade out there and done a lot of interviews and whatnot. And I'm glad to get back into the studio here. So how are you doing?
Good. Thank you. So, it's been pretty busy, spring here for us. And, it's just like, we've been running around a lot. And again, I am glad that we're back in the studio, but I'm saying that only because while we're out there, we always run into people that we just have conversations like crazy. There's today's guest, Grant. I mean, every time we see him at the conferences, it's funny because we shut down TPM one day. I think we were standing there and it was full of people. And by the time we were done with our conversation, we were like, literally, they're handing us a broom so we can clean up.
We're closing out the place.
It was crazy. I mean, there is never a time, y'all, when you go to conferences or anything and you run into Grant, I mean, be prepared to have an amazing conversation because and it can be anything. I mean, we talked about baseball, but also about industry. I mean, it was cool. I mean, and so anyway, it was y'all need to hear that crazy story about Grant and the baseball and the Blue Jays and all that. It's a fun story. But anyway,
that we wound up, it's like in the conversation, it's like we had an audience going on there too. And
yes,
participating in the conversation. So it was good. So Grant knows everybody and their dog, I think. So, hey, folks, we are, as we've said, Grant Sernick is with 3rd Wave. And we have Josh I'm blowing this.
Blinkick.
Thank you. Blinkick. And I'll tell you what, my elevator just doesn't make it all the way up, Josh. So my apologies right there. Anyway, I'd screw up a 2-car parade and a 1-block route. So forgive me on that one. All right, Josh. So, and Grant, it's like, welcome to our show. We are really excited. I'm going to get into some good discussion today. Folks, we're going to talk about how do you manage so much data now? And it's like, this is one of the AI compliance, whether it's transportation, whether it's whatever. In today's world, there's so much information that everybody is getting flooded with, and you're trying to keep up with it. And if we could do this interactively, I'd be asking the question, how many of you are managing all of your information from a compliance, import, export, transportation, whatever, your vendors and all, through spreadsheets? There is initially going to be a spreadsheet, and then you add to it. And so in looking at this, it's like, the spreadsheets may be a good starting point. But at some point, if you've got thousands and thousands of part numbers to keep up with, or hundreds of vendors, or whatever the case may be, and you're trying to deal with all of this, you're not seeing this every day. It's like, even if they were active every day, you would be going nuts. So we're going to be talking about how in a Sam Hill to manage all of this cotton picking stuff. So Grant and Josh, welcome to our show. That's kind of a round-winded way to set up a little softball for you there. But, Grant, welcome. Why don't we start with you and welcome. Tell people, obviously you're with 3rd Wave, but what do you do with them?
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you for the very kind introduction. You, I guess, don't know the rule under promise and over deliver. I hope people aren't disappointed with the conversation that's going to follow. But no, it really is a real pleasure to always see you guys at conferences whenever we happen to cross paths, and I'm a big fan of what it is that you guys do and have done over your career. So the feeling is definitely mutual. So 3rd Wave is a software company that creates software specifically designed for importers. There are one of the challenges that exists in the software space and in international supply chains that I think is important to acknowledge is that software importers require a different perspective on software than forwarders do, or other service providers. And there's a lot of software that tends to be created ostensibly for both, or that is meant to serve both. And it's our perspective that you can't do that. And so we specifically focus on importers and creating software that helps manage from an execution perspective and from a trade compliance perspective, enabling really streamlined importing, culminating in all of the customs elements, including the filing of customs entries with CBP. So we're going to talk, I think, a little bit about that, and specifically maybe managing PGAs and how complicated the data is for that. And the one commonality that all companies have, or all importers have, is sort of managing their customs entry data, 7501s, countries of origin, and things of that nature. But ultimately, that might be the easier sets of data to manage. And companies that have to deal with FDA, for instance, or NHTSA, TSCA, things of that nature, APHIS, the data sets could be dramatically more complicated to manage that.
Josh, what do you do for the company?
So, hi, and thanks for having me on the podcast. So I am the CTO at 3rd Wave. I've been with the company for around 17 years, actually. And I'm responsible for, on the technology side, the technology, the architecture, but heavily involved in the product side of things as well, in terms of determining the requirements and the market requirements, and how really the challenge of how all the data is supposed to fit together as it relates to the import process. And so not just all these data points that Grant was speaking about, but also how they get leveraged as part of process and transactions downstream from sort of what we call master data.
You can obviously tell that you're from our from up north, because of your boat, right?
Well, I was actually laughing when Andy said that we were. I think you called it late spring, and up in Canada, this is early spring. So, but it's glorious. But yeah,
when you talk about importing and all that, you're talking about U.S., not Canadian, right? The documentation and systems, right?
Correct. Yeah, we are Canadian, but our customers are American.
Okay. Well, with that, I will say on a side note, when I was working in Canada, I remember driving up to Georgian Bay, and it was in May, and I had some relatives come up, and so we wound up taking the drive from Toronto up to Georgian Bay. And had a great time. It was beautiful, just not a cloud in the sky. It was, getting to see some great country and some little shops and stuff and great food and all. And we actually went to Georgian Bay and got out, and we were walking around and thought, well, it's like, let's wade out here into the water. And it's like, shoot, man, I put my foot in that water, and I mean, it would put bumps on a goose in a heartbeat. And, there were two young kids, or 4 teenagers, 2 boys, two girls. And the 2 boys were out in the water. And after I stepped out in there, I was like, one in our group turned around and said, there must be a girl around here or something, because that water is so cotton picking cold. And it's like, they're out there trying to impress them. We were the only ones out there on that little beach area. So there were 8 of us out there. And I was like, I ain't getting in that water to swim. I thought, and the takeaway was, when is it ever going to warm up here?
It is but early spring.
Oh, yeah. And that was like, back here, in the Memphis area, the daffodils have already come and gone. The tulips have already come and gone. The azaleas are blooming and everything, it's warming. And up there in the Mississauga and Toronto area, and it's like, okay, it's nice. And we drove up there, like I said, but it's like, that water. Anyway, okay. I digress. Let's talk about this. All right. Starting with this, and from a CTO perspective, from a operational sales advisor perspective and all this, if somebody's looking at going and say, okay, management finally realizes the compliance folks just can't keep up with what's going on, either trying to keep up with classifying new goods because the parts are always being developed or new parts being added. You're trying to keep up with the different agencies. When we said PGA, by the way, folks, that means participating government agency. Another term for it was OGA, other governmental agencies. What do we mean? That means agencies other than customs. So like the FDA is prominent, the USDA, Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, the alphabet soup. All right. If you have, especially an FDA related item, you're going to have quite a few additional, an FDA product number, which is like a classification number. You're going to have registration numbers, facility registration, all this additional data. The point being is you're going to have a lot of other data fields. So as they're keeping up with this, upper management probably looks at things and goes, at some point, these people are working themselves to death. I'm having to add more and more people just because to keep up with all these spreadsheets. I need to look at doing something. So from that perspective, I guess, Grant, let me throw this one to you first, is what does somebody need to do if you're in upper management and you're looking down and you just see a lot of busy work and a lot of people working their tails off, trying to keep up with all these different spreadsheets to keep your company compliant, keep things moving, keep your supply chain going. But you can tell that they look at it and go, this isn't efficient. What would be the approach that you would have them to say? Is like, what are the questions they need to ask of their staff to get ready to say? And second, how do they go out to the industry to say, I need help? Here's the information I need to have, instead of an introductory call or initially, can they make that introductory meeting with you and other companies more productive?
Yeah, no, there's a lot there, but it's not, this is not rocket science per se. I mean, there's a lot of complexity in certain elements of trade or trade compliance, but for this one in particular, it isn't particularly difficult, right? The challenge is that the way, let's say, a trade compliance professional would experience it is that they're just overwhelmed with stuff, with spreadsheets. Maybe their spreadsheets are massive. So one of the things we see often is that, like, let's imagine, and Josh could probably talk a little bit better at this because he actually deals with many of the customers as we get into implementation, but it isn't unusual for our customers to be utilizing spreadsheets that are 150 columns wide. Now imagine that you have a spreadsheet that's 150 columns wide because there's 150 columns worth of data that you have to manage for every single part. And then let's say you have 50,000 part numbers on the spreadsheet. That's a lot of data that ultimately, you're into millions of data elements that need to be managed. That's a lot of data that you're trying to control on a spreadsheet. And by control, we mean record, not actually control, because on a spreadsheet, you're not going to be able to know who did what in what thing. Did you have a keystroke mistake? And then you have to be able to share that with your import broker, perhaps. And so you have spreadsheets crapping out. You have emailing back and forth. You have entries that have the wrong information that you're trying to figure out why that was, and so on. And this just isn't a workable solution long term, right? And quite frankly, it's been the only solution long term because spreadsheets are magical in a certain sense, right? They do just about everything. But they don't provide control. And so the primary thing is as you're going through your life and you see that you are out of control and you want better control of your data, you're in a position to understand that you need help, right? And so this is, we have a line that has stuck here at 3rd Wave, and it's now sort of on much of our marketing material, that 3rd Wave is freaking control for control freaks, right? Because we all know that trade compliance people are control freaks, and so they have to be. But that's when you feel out of control, that's the first step in virtually everything that you're going to do from a trade compliance perspective is control your data or your master data. And this is when it's time to sort of just say to yourself, hey, listen, I think we need to gain control of it. And if we're lucky enough that you want to give me a call or 3rd Wave, somebody here at 3rd Wave, then great. But you want to give somebody a call that will help you on this task. And as I said, the complexity with PGAs is oftentimes way more complicated than it is with the customs information.
Well, and you were picking up on something there that when somebody is in this proverbial, I'll call it a storm. I mean, it's like, you're working and all that, and talking about being control freaks. What you're trying to do is not from in a sense, a negative perspective. You're trying to take ownership. If you're in a compliance aspect, is you don't want things coming through that you haven't vetted properly or set up properly in your own systems. Okay, I get that. Where I see the issue is that the volume of work, the volume of transactions, be it you're classifying, being you're adding to, new parts are being added to your inventory. There are problems with inventory, so you're having to deal with exceptions or looking at different brokers, and you're having to try and manage the entries. Something gets stuck, it's in clearance problems. Then you have entry quality. You're trying to do all those transactions and things. That volume of work can be overwhelming. But here's the control freak, if you want to call it that comes into play. As that volume starts coming in, you start losing perspective, and you start working harder to try and keep up with those volumes rather than stepping back and say, all right, let's find a way to work smarter, not harder. Would that be a fair assessment, where somebody gets into this trap and then saying, hey, I've got a good solution, but they've got their, it's like, listen, it sounds great, but I can't talk to you because I'm too busy.
It's a common theme. And one of the things that we do with all our customers is, that example that you just used with things start backing up and backing up and backing up, and you have more and more and more work as it relates to your transactions, whatever they happen to be, classification or things of that nature. They tend to back up and get, one of the things that happens is they get more and more and more and more urgent, right? Because you're getting closer and closer and closer to the time when they actually need something. And one of the things that 3rd Wave is really good at is creating space to do the work, right? The worst time that you want to deal with an issue against classification or lack of data or things like that is when a shipment is sitting at the border waiting to be cleared, right? When your customs broker calls you and says, hey, we don't have this. And now all of a sudden it's a fire. And what we want to do, and I would suggest what everybody's goal ought to be in trade compliance, is to move all of the work as far ahead in the process as possible, such that you know that there are gaps in your data sets when, let's say, a purchase order is issued or an ASN is received or something like that, so that all the work is done, 2, 4, 6, or 8 weeks ahead of time before it gets to the border when something needs to be cleared. And then all of a sudden nothing becomes nothing's a fire. Everything has 8 weeks of time between them. And that's one of the things that 3rd Wave really does help companies achieve.
Okay. Now,
and Josh,
with that,
I was going to ask Josh a question about, with your solution. And of course, you said you've been with 3rd Wave for 17 years. And I mean, obviously, everything has evolved a lot, but what about any of the new, like managing this data and doing something with data and making that work a lot easier for people? Have you all, or what do you think? I guess it's not really a general question about if you have done it, but in the industry, how do you see AI working its way into this and being able to a lot easier manage this? Because I mean, we do hear a lot about AI. We hear a lot about back a few years ago about blockchain, which is coming back, but they're not calling it blockchain anymore. Now they're kind of calling it something else. But anyway, so how do you see that in the industry? Like, how is that going to, evolve or even revolutionize it, if anything?
So I spend quite a bit of time thinking about AI generally, and certainly for the applications for companies like 3rd Wave, trade compliance, and enterprise generally. I was rather bearish on blockchain. That's a whole other story going back.
That was a big buzz in something that was a hot item. Now it's artificial intelligence.
I read a lot at the time, and was quite suspicious of a lot of the claims of the problems that were going to be solved by it. AI generally, I'm much more optimistic / nervous about. Just generally, it's very difficult to, I think, predict a lot of the implications, but it's real, and there's real value there. I do get a little suspicious when you hear certain companies or industry people talk about it as if it's like fairy dust that's going to just sort of solve everybody's problems. The sort of low hanging fruit or early returns, I think, will be more on the generative AI, getting data digitized. And for companies like ours, which are very data hungry, we are trying to provide context to the data, of which there's just an enormous amount of data from purchasing, obviously transportation, compliance, inventory, all of this stuff, and sort of make the data make sense, right, for operators, for decision makers. And so AI provides, short-term an opportunity to A, make that data available, and then B, if the data has been contextualized, provide a layer that can potentially look at it, given the context, and provide answers as things go. It picks up on my hand gestures there, but I think.
Well, let me jump in here, Josh. Is that as you're pulling this together, I guess one of the things that, as we're looking at it, and as Grant, as we were talking about, somebody gets into this control freak type scenario, but they can't sustain the way they were going. So, if they're smart and they're the company ownership, the company leadership is going to be able to look at things and go, okay, we need to do something. Let's figure out ways we can do some stuff. Conceptually, from a CTO perspective, obviously you're looking at all these different spreadsheets and all this data. In today's world, it used to be, here's where I'm going with it, it should be much easier in today's world and environment to import data files, whether they're spreadsheet, whether they're the different formats of data files, into a system that can now utilize that and organize and utilize that data effectively than what it used to be. Because it used to be the scenario, you could get spreadsheets in, you could get a data file in different formats. But then there was this big challenge to data map, if you will, or map the file, the data elements in the file to whatever else. And that took time, and that used up a lot of IT resources, which is okay. There's still maybe some of that, but there's a lot of that is somewhat much more user friendly in today's world. Is that?
Yeah, I would say generally yes. I mean, it's hard to talk about AI because it's almost everywhere, right? In terms of where I sort of liken it to almost databases from 40 years ago. Like, I think, you have companies like everyone's an AI company now. They put .ai on their domain, and now they're an AI company. And there are companies that are sort of like true AI companies, but a lot of the companies that are AI companies are really companies that are just leveraging AI. And I think really sort of most companies going forward are going to be leveraging AI in some ways. And so there are general technological improvements. I mean, just even on, let's say, on software development, right? Nothing to do with trade compliance or the industry. There's revolutionary things that are happening in terms of being able to speed up the process of generating UIs, of all kinds of just generating code. And so when it comes to data mapping, I mean, the problem is data, AI in many ways needs good training sets, right, in order to be able to make sense of things. And so there still needs to be sort of organized data where things can be trained in order to make these kind of things happen. And so, for us, when we look at data, it's just amazing when we're doing an implementation. The way data can get represented is just so varied. And so if you look at something like an invoice, an invoice is relatively standard, and yet there are, there's dozens of companies now that are designed to help you take PDF invoices and digitize them and try and put those data elements into the right slots of what they are, right? But there's just so much nuance in, on the margin, and sometimes that margin matters and sometimes it doesn't. When you look at the PGA data, there's or customs data, there's just so many ways it can be represented. And typically, this is not data that's coming from a controlled system. It's, as Grant mentioned, or we talked about, it's often kept on one or more sheets in a spreadsheet or multiple spreadsheets. We have companies where they have large organizations where they're trying to consolidate maybe across 10 or 20 different departments or companies that have all maintained things differently. And so if you really want control where this field means something within your system, you have to make sure that the data that's going in is sort of right? And there's normalization, denormalization. There's the ways the data gets represented. It's still a process, and that's
Here's a problem, Andy. Here's a problem or a way to think about it. So imagine AI is something like a black box, right? You can. I talk about this a lot because lots of people say AI, like, will AI solve this? Or AI will solve this, right? And basically what they're doing is they're taking, Josh called it pixie dust, which I love, is like sort of like a magic wand, like bring, and all of a sudden, like magic happens and something has transformed from one thing to another, whatever that happens to be. And it's like magic. And it's like you would look at that and you'd say, wow, that's like totally amazing. But here's the problem with trade compliance is in trade compliance, everything has to be explicit, right? So if a product has a certain HTS code, it sort of matters why it was the product, and then matters why it's an HTS code, and then matters how you got there, and then it matters when the person classified it, and then it matters on the date, and that the validity dates of that classification might change at some point in time, and so on and so on. Like, all of this stuff needs to be explicit. And then when a product comes in on a commercial invoice and now it needs to be translated into a customs entry, that needs to be explicit. Okay. None of this is sort of like bring magic black box stuff, right? It's all explicit. And so what Josh is really saying is, like, on the margins, AI can do pretty amazing things. But when it comes to fundamental trade compliance activities, having magic isn't helpful, right? We're trying
you need the system ultimately still to control the data, right? There's got to be somewhere to put stuff. And
you guys are going down the road that I was going to make a comment on, is that, to me, the application of use of artificial intelligence, which is the big thing that everybody's trying to do, can only happen after you get good data. And with that, it's like you've got to convert your handwritten notes, your little card files, which I don't know if anybody's really using that anymore, but you've got spreadsheets here and there, and you got different ones handling things. And and on an exception, and they got a notebook and they pull it out and say, oh yeah, this is what I got to do. All of that's got to get digitized somehow. And once it's in a system and in the process, then you can start applying, okay, let's take this and have these tables compared to other tables to see the accuracy. And boom, here comes the exceptions. Somebody needs to look at this stuff. Here's this scenario here where now we can put this kind of data in here, and it's now going to be archived after a certain period of time. I don't have to go in and strip it out and archive it. I can, and these massive updates. If I just update my system, there's an audit trail there. Your system can do those things, or other people's systems as well. But where I'm going is that you've got to have that somehow to say, how do we take this information and get it into a process that I have, here's the other thing, talking about control freaks. Part of the scenario here is a business owner would look at something, or an executive, and go, I want to make this more efficient. And no disrespect to you, Josh, but IT people say, oh yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that. We can do that. Take you 100 million man hours and $1 billion, but I can do anything you want to do. It's like, no. Let's get it, However, there's always seems to be a disconnect between the IT saying, yes, we can do these things, versus then you've got the actual end user, and the system needs to work for the user, not the user for the system. So how do we get there? And that's where I'm going to say, as we get into this, the compliance people in this particular case that we're talking about have to have the confidence. I've got all my notes. I got all this data. We put it into that system. Am I going to be able to extract out of that system now in an organized fashion that gives me the data the way I need it, when I need it? And that's a challenge in some of the system may do it, but it may not be configured quite right or whatever. And that person doesn't have that confidence. So there's Jumpy as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs going, I put in all my data into this system. I don't know if it's going to work or not, And so how do you get to the point where we take this information, and when you're talking to people, Grant, when you're going in and you're doing the deal, to me, the folks like Josh are the ones that are like, yeah, we can do this. And here's the logistics of doing it. But how do you get people over that hump and their fear to say, let me give you guys a shot?
Well, okay. So, that's a great question. There are you mentioned two different scenarios, which are probably on a reasonably long spectrum, 2 points on a long spectrum. But if you're trying to we work in a complicated world, right? This trade compliance world is very complicated, and this is all we do, right? And we do this for many companies, and we've worked very, very hard to understand the challenges to deal with this. And once upon a time, when we first started, it was a very, very challenging thing. How can we trust this company to do what we think we need to be done? And when you don't have any customers, it's hard to explain to get over that hurdle, right? In today's world, we do this for many customers, and this is all we spend our time doing. And Josh has a line that hasn't managed to make it into our marketing materials, at least not yet. But it is. There's nothing artificial about our intelligence, right? Josh has built with his team this incredible platform that does everything that you just explained, Andy, that needs to be done, from collecting the data, making sense of that data, putting the data together, validating it, making the exceptions visible in a easy and intuitive way for the user so that they can now address the challenges that they have. This is a 17-year process and we're now on V5. So 17 years, 5 versions trying to get to this endpoint. If you were looking to try to build this on your own, as an importer whose business it is not to be developing software, what are the chances that you're going to get there, right? And conversely, what are the chances that maybe a company like 3rdwave has figured this out, right? And I think your perspective is exactly right, and your understanding of how AI can help is really good. And there are places where AI is going to help, and as Josh said, like, AI is becoming ubiquitous and is an incredible tool. But the infrastructure that's required, like, you cannot get rid of infrastructure as a requirement to making solutions. And I would say, I won't even talk for 3rdwave. I'll just say from my perspective, people wave their magic hands or their magic wand or drop their pixie dust and say, yeah, AI. And it's like, anytime I see that, I'm like, yeah, but I don't think that that's going to work, or you're going to have to explain to me how it is, because especially in the trade compliance world, explicit is the answer.
Well, to that point, and I will say, Josh, let me come to you.
You know what? Hey,
and
guys, real quick, we only have 4 minutes. Okay. So I don't want to.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Josh, let me come to you here on this, is that, let's say that a company comes in, they sell the deal, and they, from a CTO perspective, and obviously in a 3rdwave perspective here, I guess I'll ask this: is that how is it that your group can give this? Like, you've taken all this data, it's come from all this chaos, and you've been able to import it in, organize it. How is it that your group now can convey the confidence of a compliance group that says, okay, this has been well worth it, so that then the folks like the Grants of the world can go back to the upper management and say, okay, we've got it and we're working, and it'll be a continuous process, obviously. But what is it that your groups do that you like to promote from a CTO perspective?
So what I would say is, Grant mentioned, and I mentioned, we've been doing this for a very long time. And, you asked Andy about, like, how to convey to them. We have been, when we show them our software, I started going to ICPI the last couple of years, right? And what became apparent is you have these people, and for the most part, unless they're super large organizations, they are kind of left on their own, right? They've got their spreadsheets and they're doing very, very intricate things. As you speak to them, the amount of minutia that's being dealt with is, it's very deep. And we have been working with these companies for a very long time. And, we want our software to, when it's used, feel delightful, right? That it was designed with them in mind. And so I do think that when we actually sit down and run a demo, when I'm called in or when Grant is doing it, that one of the goals of the software is that when these users see the software, it's an aha moment, right? I see them doing what I need to be done. And as if the software is designed, it's the one thing about customs is they tell you what the rules are, right? And they tell you what the requirements are. And so we've been building the software for a very long time. It's not complete. There's all sorts of, areas we haven't gone to. And when we bring on new customers, we close those gaps, right? But that, and Grant could speak to it, but when my goal as the CTO is that when the software gets in front of a pro, there's no BSing, right? Like it either does what they need or doesn't. And I spend a lot of hours thinking about sort of what people in the industry need and the operators. And we're constantly, in contact with the operators about their needs. And we've got some very good, long-standing customers who are, constantly working with us, and government changes their rules, and we're adapting. And so, I don't know, Grant, I'll hand it to you.
Well, let me close it out this way: is that, Grant, the takeaway here for somebody in a leadership role, whether they're the owner or they're executive, they're manager of a department, whatever, what would be the next steps that they see a need to see, we've got to be more, we got to get more productive in the way we're handling this? What would you recommend to our listeners here to say, what do they need to do as far as next steps before they can bring somebody in to say, should we consider this or look at their software or whatever?
Well, I think that there's, one thing that needs to be acknowledged right off the bat, and that is that just things are getting more complex, right? We've been talking about PGAs. PGAs are A, not going away, but B, there's more stuff that's being introduced. Organics was just introduced in FDA. There will be more and more requirement pushed down, which is going to require a higher demand on data. So whatever challenges you have today as it relates to spreadsheets, it's getting worse, right? And as an executive, you need to acknowledge that your trade compliance people are stressed and underwater, and they need help. And once you get there, it's not like the solutions are necessarily particularly crazy expensive. You just have to get there to understand that their time is valuable, that people are valuable, and they are doing one thing that we can all agree on, I mean, we're at ICP all the time, is these are some of the best people that care more than anybody else about keeping your company out of trouble. And you need to give them the support they need to do the job to keep you out of trouble. That's what they need. They don't need a lot of support. They just need a little bit. And so if you can get there, then you can solve the problem. And, if 3rd Wave happens to be a company that you want to call, then get in touch with me. I'd love to hear from you.
Folks, it's this is one of those where if you're dealing with lots of data, don't know what's going on, get an expert to come in here. 3rd Wave obviously is a good one. There's several companies out there. We're going to have Grant and Josh's contact information in the show notes here that you can reach out to them, as well as if, worst comes to worst and you're trying to track it down, send a note out to Lalo or myself, and we will get you to the right parties. But all said and done, this is one where if you're dealing with the complexities and you're still dealing with spreadsheets and manual books and all that, or even if you have a system that's been around a while that just doesn't seem that, it takes an act of Congress to try and get it enhanced to handle new data elements, maybe time for you guys to take a look at some things. So with that, I hope you'll take a look, and this show will be something to stimulate your thoughts into asking your staff, what is it that's going on and what would be the ideal situation for you? So incorporating artificial intelligence still comes back to, as Josh was saying, you got to get good data in there and do something with it first before the applications can take over. So Grant, Josh, Lalo and I greatly appreciate you coming on the show and talking with us. I'm sure we're going to have some more discussions because there's a lot more we could get into here.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate how you having us on.
Thanks very much.
Folks, have a great day, and we're going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.